scheme of things. So persecution is beginning to come in as this war becomes more community-based, communal and factionalized. As the communities break down, so Sunni radicals is reshaping their areas and saying to the Christians, you support Assad, we will kill you. For example, if you have a person who drives a car for a government official, he is being targeted and will probably be kidnapped and killed simply because he is working, quote, for the government. So are all Christians, therefore, to leave their government posts? You've got Christian leaders who are now actually being targeted. You now have rising criminality, as we saw during the Iraq period, where kidnapping is occurring. And so the Christians now find themselves increasingly beleaguered between Assad's military actions on the one hand and a collapsing society with the rise of extremism where they're being deliberately targeted on the other.
And of course, their fears for the future are tremendous, depending on how this conflict pans out. But what's the attitude of Syrian Christians to international attempts to intervene then, Patrick? Do they want other nations to become involved in the conflict or not?
In speaking with Christian leaders, and may I say, I've been going into Syria for more than 20 years. I've traveled the length and breadth of the country. And the real sad thing is, up till this so-called Arab Spring, President Assad was moving the country towards democratic reforms, a free market economy, freedom in the media, press, internet. In fact, increases in tourism as a superb country. Of course, all of that is now going backwards. And so the Christians are actually saying to the West, and they've said it to me, they've said it to others, we cannot understand Western countries. How can Western countries like Britain and America actually support Saudi Arabia and Qatar, extremist countries without any democracy, to destroy our country, when in fact we were living peacefully, as a majority of people were, under the Assad regime, which we knew was totalitarian, but actually was bringing about changes. So they feel betrayed by the Western political, not least the UK, government. Secondly, they believe that the Western media is not being fair. If I can give you an illustration, my last visit there a couple of months ago, a pastor, an evangelical pastor, said to me from one part of Syria, I looked on the television and I saw lots of demonstrations in my street. Well, I couldn't believe this. So I went out, looked up and down my street, and there was nobody there. And yet the media was saying at that moment in time there were demonstrations. What has happened now is the use of social media, whereby a handheld mobile phone can actually focus on 3 or 4 people, set it into a wider context, can be carried on television, and suddenly everyone sees, hey, a major demonstration is taking place.
Yeah.
So we have the manipulation of media. And so the Christians are saying, well, nobody is coming to ask us about what is happening. Instead, we're seeing this on television, and we cannot understand how the Western media can put out such disinformation. I think the third thing is this. They feel, and this happened in Iraq, that Western Christians do not care about them.
Yeah.
And I would argue that is true. If you look at Iraq, and I was in Iraq from 1998, so I knew it in the Saddam regime. I was there constantly throughout, and we are still there. Barnabas Fund was involved at every level. The real problem was the masses of Christians in the West initially didn't recognize there were Christians in Iraq. And I remember the first thing I sent out was, there are Christians in Iraq. Then when they heard there were, they didn't know what to do. They were supporting their government, and the government was destroying Saddam's forces. So who cared about the Christians? They were, sadly, a consequence of war, collateral damage. Having failed so badly in Iraq, we are now in danger of doing exactly the same in Syria.
I mean, it's almost like Saddam Hussein, isn't it? I mean, the character in power, Assad, may be fairly dark, and he may have associations with terrorist groups. He may be backed by Iran, but the problem is, you get rid of him, and what's the alternative?
And that is where, may I say, the great failure of the US and UK was. They did not look at the consequences of the effects.
Yeah.
The effects of that Iraq war, you get rid of Saddam Hussein, all right then, but what are the consequences of the effects of getting rid of him? A destabilized society where massive conflict occurred. Now, I believe the same thing is actually now developing in Syria, and community will turn on community, and are we then going to wash our hands of this? Now, there are things we could consider. For example, could we look, government and media, at a possible reconstruction of Syria? For example, you take the northern part of Syria, as we've got in Iraq, Kurdistan in Iraq. There are many Kurds, for example, that have lived peaceably with the Christians in the north. Could the Christians and the Kurds constitute an element in a federal Syria, whereby you have ethnic groups within their geographical regions that could then be protected by the international community? Yeah. These are the kinds of things which our government and the media could begin to explore at this stage. But I don't see anything like that beginning to happen.
What's Barnabas Fund doing at the moment then in Syria to help these people, Patrick, and how can people help?
We have been actually urging, firstly, prayer. I know some may say, well, what good is this? I'm a committed Christian. I believe profoundly in the power of the Lord, and although the past years, the Barnabas Fund has pioneered work in the Muslim world, particularly in terms of advocacy, information, our arguments, what we have put forward. And although it's a rapidly deteriorating situation, we still have to believe the Lord is in control and that he is fulfilling his purposes in these days, and that he will keep his people. And we have to, therefore, to continue to pray and call the church to pray. But secondly, that prayer must occur out of a heart full of concern and full of love for our suffering brothers and sisters. And I don't see that on a Sunday where Christians, looking at what is happening, feel so passionate that their hearts break and they begin to weep and cry. Everything within me says prayer and emotion goes together, and we see this as Jesus at the graveside of Lazarus. Yes. His heart was so broken that he broke down and wept. Why are we now weeping? Then I think, thirdly, humanitarian assistance. We in the Barnabas Fund are putting in about 100,000 euros a month into Syria. Up till recently, we were about the only Christian group engaging in any major relief effort. We have a committee in Syria and Lebanon. The committee is made up of the senior church leaders, and we have a similar committee in Lebanon. So funds go in. It provides money for food, increasingly rent as people are dislocated, medical supplies, all forms of humanitarian aid to bring strength, health, and support for our suffering brothers and sisters. It's well managed, it's transparent, and may I say, it's desperately needed. And it's sad that BF Barnabas Fund is almost alone in what we are actually trying to do, and we desperately need Christians to be involved with us, to pray, to feel, and to become involved in the humanitarian relief of our suffering brothers and sisters.
Well, indeed. And one way to find out about what's going on would be presumably to visit your website and get information, and presumably one can donate through the website too.
That is correct. Absolutely correct. It's www.barnabasfund.org.
www.barnabasfund.org, and we'll mention that again later on in the show this evening. Dr. Patrick Sookhdeo, Director of the Barnabas Fund, thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us an eye-opening account of what's happening in Syria at the moment, particularly as far as our Christian brothers and sisters are concerned. Thank you very much. It's been excellent talking to you.
Thank you so much, Stu, for having me and for allowing me to share my heart's burden and concerns for our brothers and sisters in Syria.